These are my worst ever crashes. Each one taught me something crucial about track riding, and some made me question it altogether. As these crashes get bigger and scarier throughout this video, you'll realise how they shaped me into the rider I am today. Hopefully you can learn from a few of my mistakes so you don't make the same ones yourself. So we need to start at the very beginning, and that is 2008 for me. It was my first season racing motorbikes at British Championship, and I distinctly remember my mum saying one thing to me: well, we'll see if you still enjoy racing after you've had your first big crash. And inevitably that was always going to come, and at this time I was 15 years old and we travelled all the way to Spain for our first pre-season test of the year. And that's where it all went wrong. Unfortunately, I was hit by another rider. As I turned into the corner, they came right underneath me and they fired me off to the side of the track. I went careering through the gravel, hit a wall head on, and unfortunately broke my collarbone and knocked myself out. It was only when I came round laying in the gravel trap that I had half an idea what I'd done. I still remember now my mum being all excited, thinking I was hopefully now going to stop racing. Unfortunately for her, all I was concerned about was the fact that I was missing the next Red Bull Rookies test and not whether I was going to finish racing altogether. So that was definitely my most painful crash to date, but definitely not as annoying as the next one. This one was in 2010. Fast forward 3 years and I was running at the front of British Championship in the 125 class by this point. I was having a good season, fighting for the championship. I'd won a few races and broke a few lap records. It was coming down to the crunch time of the championship. We were at Silverstone and of course it was chucking it down with rain. Now, I normally fancy myself in the wet as a good wet weather rider, and I took off at the start of the race. I had no idea what was going on behind me. I just thought everyone was right behind me the whole time. So I was pushing like mad to try and get away from everyone. It was only then, at the end of the first lap at Silverstone, where I high-sided, landed flat on my back, gave myself half a concussion, stood up and realised that there was still no one to be seen. I didn't know I was 4 or 5 seconds in front of everyone at this point and I'd crashed out of a massive lead. Not only throwing away that race, but my championship too at that point. And now I don't say this lightly, nothing could have prepared me for my next crash. Fast forward another year, it's 2011 and I'm racing in the final season of the 125 Grand Prix Championship. I've had a pretty up and down season. I finished 5th in my second race and then went on to have a numerous amount of mechanical failures during the year. And before this final round, I'd already decided to part ways with the team for the year after. Nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen, and that was it rained in the qualifying session. I high-sided at the first corner, something I'd done 12 months before at Silverstone, but that wasn't the big problem. I landed at the side of the track, scurried off over the barrier and behind the fence. It was at this point a marshal picked me up and put me on the back of a scooter. And when this scooter took off, I was on the back of Pedro. He took off back to the paddock, flat out through this tunnel, and it was only where this tunnel comes back up to meet the circuit on the other side that Pedro decided he wasn't going to roll off. And we went round a corner just as it levelled out on top, faster than I'd just gone around turn 1, 2 up on a scooter. So as you can imagine, we high-sided, 2 up, landed flat on our backs, me and Pedro on the floor, and I looked at Pedro, screaming at him because I was so angry. I'd had a terrible season. This marshal had now crashed with us both on the back. I was so annoyed and so angry. So I grabbed his scooter and took off back to my garage. Left him on the floor because I really thought he was just laying it on thick because he was so embarrassed as to what he'd just done. Later that night, I was in the physio centre getting some work done on some of my injuries from the day. And it was only at that point I heard the physios laughing about a story from earlier that day, where a rider had took a scooter from a marshal that had crashed with them both on the scooter. I put my hand up and said, yeah, that was me, laughing back to them. It was at this point that I found out Pedro had unfortunately broken his femur and he was laid on the floor screaming because his leg was broken, and I just took his scooter and ran off. So apologies to Pedro, I was just frustrated with the whole incident and I do hope your leg got better. But that was nothing in comparison to my next mistake, which was 100% my fault. It was 2013, this was now my second year of racing the Supersport class, and I was feeling pretty confident and comfortable with my new Taiko Suzuki. We'd had a great 3 days on track, the test was coming to a close, and as the day comes to an end in Spain, the temperature notoriously drops off quite quickly. The track temperature dives and there can be a lot less grip available at that time in the evening. But this is where I learned a painful and expensive lesson when I exited one of the corners at the back of the circuit. And it was at this point I was making sure that I wasn't in the way of anyone behind me. I'd finished my session and I was coming in. So I turned around going down this right-hander down a hill. But what I didn't realise was as I looked behind, it completely distorted my hand and my feeling of where I was on the throttle. So as I went down the hill and turned behind me, the track dropped away from me, causing me to open the throttle. as I'd leant into the corner, and as I opened the throttle, the bike went completely sideways with me with one hand on the handlebar. I was launched to the moon and it absolutely destroyed the bike. It went end over end, both the wheels were destroyed, everything was wrecked. So it ended a really positive test in a very bad way, therefore teaching me to be very, very careful anytime you're looking behind on a race circuit. But then came a very painful crash that changed the way I ride forever. Up until 2015, I would say I was very confident at backing a bike in. Riding that Suzuki, it taught me all the skills I needed to back a bike in, and I became very confident in doing it. I'd also never had anything go wrong when I was backing it in, which was the case all the way up until 2015, when I exited the pits to test my teammate's bike. I was given a different engine brake map in my bike, and unfortunately on my first flying lap at Snetterton, I went into the first corner and into the second corner, which is a really tight hairpin, and as I entered the tight hairpin, this new engine brake map basically just locked the rear wheel solid, and I went from being bolt upright to on my head in a split second. It was the first time I'd crashed backing a bike in, and I couldn't tell you how much that hurt, especially when it was off throttle and I wasn't expecting it at all. As I went up in the air, I landed and bashed my head really hard. I wasn't knocked out, but it definitely took the wind out of my sails and definitely took the edge off me ever backing a bike in as much as that ever again. But the next crash I had changed my approach to my racing very early on in the season. This was 2016, the year I won the National Superstock 1000 Championship, and it's fair to say I was very confident from the start of the season. I was fast in pre-season testing, I won the opening race at Silverstone, and we'd now moved on to Brands Hatch for round 3. It was in qualifying and I'd already done a lap fast enough to be on pole position. I came into the pits and got the mechanics to make a small change to the front suspension. Overconfident and way too cocky, I went back out to go even faster than I'd already gone. And it was at that moment that I lost the front going down Paddock Hill at Brands Hatch. Unfortunately for me, as I lost the front, I slid towards the back of the bike, my foot touched the back wheel and it flicked the bike upwards. The bike went end over end, smashed itself to bits through the gravel trap, and unfortunately wrote the bike off completely. A disappointing way to end that qualifying session, but luckily I managed to make up for it the next day when I won the race to say sorry to the mechanics. Now, although I'd picked up some injuries along the way up until this point in the early part of my career, nothing could prepare me for the next 2 weeks of my career. The next crash at the age of 24 made me realise I was finally getting older. It was 2017, I was riding for the official Suzuki team in the British Superbike Championship, and it's fair to say we had a challenging year to begin the year. It was a brand new bike that season, and it was taking a lot of getting used to for both me and the team, and we were working through quite a lot of problems up until this point. Getting into the later part of the year, we had some upgrades from Suzuki and everything was working a lot better. Keen to make an impression and keep my seat for the next season, on the first lap at Silverstone, just as I committed to go for a gap up the inside on the first lap, that gap vanished. 2 riders came across the front of me, I had nowhere to go, and I stood on the back brake as hard as I could to try and slow myself down. As I stood on the back brake, it completely locked the rear wheel, high-siding me over the handlebars and collecting everyone on the way through. I was sliding along the floor when my foot came into contact with the grass, and as my foot hit the grass, my foot folded like that and broke half of my foot. Despite having a lot of crashes over the years up until that point, most of my injuries have been fairly minor, and as they say when you're young, you do bounce well. And this was the first turning point where I realised I didn't bounce as well anymore and crashes began to hurt. I was very keen to make an impression, and we were running out of races before the end of the season. In racing, if you don't get back on the horse, someone else will, and they'll take your seat for the year after. So 2 weeks later, I rode again in Assen with a broken foot to try and save my ride. It was definitely too soon and I shouldn't have been riding, and it unfortunately rained in the qualifying session. I didn't have a good feeling with the bike at all, and I'd actually decided that I was going to pull in this lap. So as I was making my way back to the pits, I really don't know what happened, but I had the smallest, slowest high side off the hairpin. And somehow, out of nowhere, as the bike flicked me over the top, my hand hung onto the handlebar. I was flicked onto my back where my head hit the floor, it opened my visor, and the handlebar went straight through my visor into my face. At which point my arm was also raised in the air and it dislocated and broke my shoulder at the same time. So I was now laid on the floor with a broken foot from 2 weeks before, a dislocated and broken shoulder, and a bleeding face where the handlebar had smashed me in the face. And the good news was I also lost my seat at the end of the season too. Now, if I thought 2 high sides within 2 weeks was bad, that could not have prepared me for 2 high sides in an hour. Fast forward to the end of 2019, I'd had a great season riding for Bathams and I finished second in the championship. Because the championship was already decided, Tyco BMW, or Cinetic BMW at the time, kindly allowed me to do a wildcard in the Superbike class. I'd had a solid weekend, I was inside the top 3 in the wet and qualified in the top 9, and I was confident on race day that I'd be able to do a good job. Unfortunately, I didn't get much further than morning warm-up, where I high-sided onto the back straight in the wet. I still don't really know what happened, but I high-sided coming onto the back straight, barrel rolled through the gravel, and definitely knocked the wind out of my sails before the Superstock race. I was annoyed because I was doing a good job in Superstock that weekend anyway and qualified on pole, and I was excited for the race ahead. Now bizarrely, not only did I have my first high side on that Superbike this weekend, I also had my first high side on my Superstock bike at the exact same corner in the dry conditions literally an hour later. Only this one I hit the ground even harder, knocked the wind out of my sails and bashed my head so hard that I can't really remember what happened. But 2 big high sides were honestly nothing compared to the slowest crash of my career in 2020, which wasn't actually even at a racetrack. This was where we did a lot of our training, and it was a track we rode at multiple times a week for 30 to 40 minutes at a time. Obviously with that many laps around the track, we crashed quite a few times, but nothing ever serious really happened. Until now. As I was approaching the corner, I lost the front going in, and as I lost the front, the bike went one way, and unfortunately my leg got caught on the ground and my leg went the other way, breaking the top off my fibula and tearing the MCL ligament in my knee. But when you crash when you're racing, you're full of adrenaline, and honestly the pain a lot of the time doesn't kick in until 20 minutes later. This crash with no adrenaline was honestly one of the worst experiences of my life. I felt the whole thing, I heard a noise when it happened, and it was honestly just so painful. And the doctor told me there and then that I wouldn't be able to race for the rest of the season. We weren't even at round 1 at this point. I did force myself back onto a bike that season at the first round, but it definitely wasn't my best season, and a lot of it was thanks to that injury. But that then takes us on to my final and my most viral crash out of any crash I've ever had. We need to go back to 2015, where I was having a pretty rough time of it. This bike had numerous mechanical issues during the year, and this race was no different. I exited the 4th corner at Snetterton and I began to hear the bike make a noise. I wasn't sure what it was, so I was just going to ride it back to the pit so the team could investigate. Now that season I was racing the Kawasaki ZX-10, and the frame on that bike comes up quite high, and as it was close to the engine the frame got quite warm, and it used to make my legs warm on the inside. So as I came around the 5th corner I could feel this warm sensation but didn't really think anything of it, until I got to the 6th corner and I began to see a flame come out the front of the airbox. When I saw this flame I looked down at my foot, at which point I realised my whole bike was on fire, and at that point all my survival skills just kicked in all at once. My initial thought process was, although my bike's on fire, I'm not in any pain and I'm not burning, so I need to get this to the side of the track as quick as I can. But that's when the fire in my bike had other ideas. Just as I managed to slow the bike down a little bit, I got to the edge of the track, at which point I managed to slow the bike down a little bit, but as I got to the side of the track, I just felt my whole leg all in one go feel like it was on fire. And my total natural instinct was to just jump. So I jumped backwards, pushed the bike away from me, the bike carried on by itself for a little bit and stopped next to the barrier. Luckily, and I don't know how, I didn't burn myself at all, and the marshals quickly put the bike out, which was great. My experiences of crashes definitely do suck, but as long as you learn from each one, they definitely make you a better rider. The key isn't avoiding mistakes, it's learning from them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.